At first glance, today's gospel might come off to us as being a bit odd. And the church even seems to be saying that because the church gives us an option to do either the longer form, which I read today, or a shorter form that kind of cuts out the second part, cuts out the second half. And I use that wording, right, second half, on purpose, because it seems like we have two completely different stories. But if we look a little closer, there is, I think, a connection. And looking at it, we can even realize that the two parts actually go together quite well. Hopefully, you will think the same when I'm finished with my homily. So the gospel begins with Jesus hearing the news of the arrest of John the Baptist. I remember John was a relative of Jesus, and so the news of his arrest would have been, bad news for him. He wouldn't have been excited to hear that. This event, right, the arrest of John the Baptist, had a real effect on Jesus. It caused him, we heard, to leave Nazareth. Caused him to go to the city of Capernaum. And that's basically that first half of the gospel, right? That Jesus learns of the arrest of John the Baptist and he withdraws to Galilee. Now, objectively, we would say that that is a bad thing, right? The arrest of John the Baptist is a bad thing. We know that Herod goes on to kill him. But now we go to the second half of the gospel. Right, Jesus has gone to Capernaum, it says, by the sea, and he goes out walking. Beautiful, right by the lake. Probably a nice day for a walk. And as he's walking, he sees Simon Peter and he sees Andrew, and he calls them. Right, he invites them to follow him. Then, because it's such a nice day, right, they keep walking. They keep going on. And he sees James and John, and he calls them too. Now, Jesus is starting to gather his apostles to him, starting to call people to him to help him in his work, especially to carry on his mission whenever he dies. Now, again, remember, Jesus is in Capernaum because of the arrest of John the Baptist. It's not a good thing that led him to that city. Right? Jesus was fully human, and so he probably would have been sad at the fact that his relative had been arrested. But in Capernaum, Jesus starts doing great things. Right? He begins selecting his apostles. He begins choosing those few to carry on his mission once he departs from earth. And so I think that this is the link between the two halves, or the two parts of today's gospel. That even out of what seem to be horrible events, Jesus can bring about good. And this link shines light on the somber anniversary that we remember this week. Right? That this week celebrates, or not really celebrates, but remembers the anniversary of the legalization of abortion in our country. And since 1973, when that happened, nearly 60 million children have been aborted. Not to mention, right, the unimaginable toll that this takes on the parents of those children and those close to them. Now, I'm not casting stones, or I'm not saying that people who've had an abortion are horrible people. I can't imagine, right, what somebody would have to be going through to think that that's the only option, right, that to think that that is a good way out. Now, maybe you're thinking to yourself, right, how is that a link in our gospel? Well, in the gospel we see good being brought about from a horrible event. Right? The arrest of John the Baptist leads to Jesus going away and calling his disciples to himself, right? Beginning to form them for their mission. A horrible event which manifests, right, the presence of evil in our world leads to God showing us his power. Leads to God showing us that good overcomes evil. right? The evil didn't cause the good. We would rather that the evil had not happened at all. But God shows us that good overcomes evil, that light overcomes darkness. And so maybe we're asking ourselves, what is the good that has come about from abortion? And we might rephrase that question, right? What is the good that God has done in the wake of the disrespect of human life that we see in many different ways all around us? Now, this next part, I say in all humility, all right? I think that I am part of the good that God is doing, right? Not me personally, but me as a priest, right? I'm part of that good that God is doing. Because in the wake of decades of disregard for human life in so many ways, vocations to the priesthood and the religious life are flourishing. Men and women are tired of the mediocrity and the unhappiness that the world offers them. And so they're coming forth in waves to lay down their lives fully in service of Christ and His church. When I began the seminary just 8 years ago, there were 30 seminarians. That's a pretty good number. But now, just 8.5 years later, we have almost 50 men studying for our diocese. Some have even gone off and studied for religious orders. And it's not just priests and religious, right? But there is a wave of young people becoming active in their faith. They're going to daily mass. They're going to confession on a regular basis. They're striving to live out the church's teachings. They're doing the best they can to be holy husbands and wives and moms and dads, to be holy students and friends. Right? Look at the massive crowds that have gathered the past few years for the World Youth Days and tell me that God is not working, that God is not doing good things in the world. In the midst of the darkness that seems to be all around us, God is reminding us that light overcomes darkness. In the midst of the world being in a state of upheaval and uncertainty, Christ continues to give us the church. Through the church founded upon that rock of St. Peter, who we heard him called today, we are given hope. And we're, like the apostles, we're called to leave everything and to follow Jesus. So we see that the gospel presented to us today is not as maybe divided as it seems at first. There are two distinct parts, but those two parts fit together quite well. Jesus, in a sense, is forced out of Nazareth, and he heads to Capernaum in Galilee. But his work isn't ruined, right? He doesn't sit there and pout and say, oh, they kicked me out of Nazareth, now what am I going to do? No, right? He keeps bringing about good. It might take a little different route than maybe we thought it would, but he keeps doing good. And what does St. Matthew quote from Isaiah after he tells us about Jesus' journey to Capernaum? He says, land of Zebulun and Naphtali. Right? This is where Jesus has gone. The people who sit in darkness have seen a great light. On those dwelling in a land overshadowed by death, light has arisen. And so we can say the same about our times. That God's goodness, right? God who is himself goodness, is not overcome by evil. There certainly is evil present in our world, perhaps nowhere more visible than in the fact that we have a law that states that abortion is okay. But in the midst of all of that darkness, precisely on those who dwell in the darkness, those who dwell in a land overshadowed by death, light arises. And so we don't lose hope because Christ is our hope. We're spurred on by the fact that Christ, in the midst of the darkness of the world, is continuing to call forth men and women to follow him. Jesus is calling each one of us to follow him in some way. Will we respond? Will we do it? I'll go out on a limb and say that there are probably a few people in here who are being called in that special way to be priests or religious. And so to you, I ask, are you willing to lay down your life to help spread the light of Christ on those dwelling in a land overshadowed by death? Are you willing to leave everything and to follow Christ when he calls? Are you willing to leave it immediately and to follow Jesus so that he can make you a fisher of men?